My name is David Campbell. I am a faculty member at the University of Notre Dame. And at least in part, I'm here today because I am the director of Notre Dame's Democracy Initiative, which was mentioned by John McGreevy, our provost, in his introductory remarks. You can think of the Democracy Initiative at Notre Dame as Notre Dame's statement for why we as an institution care deeply about the study of, the defense of, the advocacy for democracy both here in the United States and around the world. And we are so grateful for the Keough School and the Kellogg Institute for the fantastic work that they are doing and have done and will do on this theme, this conference being a leading example. My role today is very small. I am merely the moderator for a panel of 4 people who have far more interesting things to say than I could ever claim. So I will briefly introduce them, then turn the time over to each of them, who will speak for 12 minutes each, strictly enforced by a timekeeper right in front. Tom in the earlier panel said that the cards never say, "We love what you're saying, keep speaking." We want you to know that's the vibe. We love what you're saying, but we do nonetheless have to keep to a schedule. Following their remarks, we'll see. I may have a question or two, or we may throw it to the audience right away. We'll see how that goes. Either way, you will have an opportunity to pose questions to our panelists. Let me begin then with introductions. Going from the far end closer to me, we'll start with Laura Gamboa, who is my colleague at Notre Dame. She's an assistant professor of democracy and global affairs. And of course, with each one of these people, I could list all of their many accomplishments, but if I did that, we wouldn't have enough time to hear the clever things they're going to say. So forgive me for brief introductions, but so we have Laura Gamboa. Next, Holly Ann Garnett, the class of 1965 professor of leadership and an associate professor of political science and economics at the Royal Military College of Canada. Next to her, we have Ugur Ozdemir, who is a lecturer in quantitative political science at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland. And last but certainly not least, we have S.Y. Quraishi, the former Chief Election Commissioner of India and an honorary professor at the Cluster Innovation Center at the University of Delhi. And I just wanted to note that this panel represents, in a microcosm, what we are hoping to do with this conference. We have a global representation here on the stage. We have a mix of academics and practitioners, and even within the world of academia, we have a mix of disciplines. So please join me in welcoming our panelists and our first speaker. Come on up.
Thank you, everybody, for being here. Thank you to the Kellogg Institute and the Keough School for organizing this event. I'm very much looking forward for all the presentations. So they've posed us 3 questions, focusing mostly on electoral management bodies and political parties. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to let the various experts in this panel discuss at length electoral management bodies. And I am going to talk about political parties more broadly, mostly based on my experience in Latin America, although I think some of the things I'm saying are going to resonate across for people trying to understand cases of backsliding across the world. So I think the question posed were like, are parties important for stopping backsliding and why? So I think political parties are key for 2 stages of executive aggrandizement. First, they can help prevent the rise of leaders with authoritarian tendencies. And second, they can also help stop or reverse democratic backsliding once these leaders are in power. To understand the role of political parties in both of these stages, however, I think it's useful to think about the 2 core functions that political parties do. On the one hand, they do horizontal coordination. They coordinate between politicians, ambitious politicians, both within electoral cycles and between electoral cycles. Second, they perform a function of vertical aggregation. That is, they mobilize, aggregate, and channel collective interests and demands. And both functions are incredibly important for for democracy, broadly speaking. They're also important for understanding democratic backsliding. But I think the second one matters the most and is the one that we're struggling with the most. And in the previous presentation, various people talked about this from various angles. I think political parties, at least in Latin America, have been struggling to meet voters where they are and aggregate their interests and translate their interests into certain types of policies. Even in countries with nominally strong parties like the United States, parties are having difficulties aggregating and articulating voters, interest groups, social movements, and civil society organizations. Now, parties that cannot perform their vertical aggregation function have several detrimental consequences. But broadly speaking, they weaken individuals' trust in political representation altogether, right? So if parties cannot channel citizens' demands, more and more what we observe is people distrust on political parties initially, politicians, and then politics more broadly, right? And what we're seeing today, what I'm observing, both in the US, but also in places like Peru, also in places like Central America, what you see is this idea that politics is worthless, that being a politician is a dirty occupation, akin to a grifter, right? And that people who win elections, they win elections not because they are experienced at their job, which would be, by the way, the requirement we would ask from anybody from any other job, right? But because they actually don't have experience in their job. They win politics because they are not politicians, right? And this is pervasive. Now, this anti-political sentiment is detrimental for democracy for two reasons. First, it opens up the space for leaders with anti-systemic populist discourses to attain power. This is where we see the rise, and the previous panel mentioned this several times. This is where we see people like Hugo Chavez, Nayib Bukele, or even Donald Trump to rise to office. Second, and perhaps less discussed, is the fact that it hinders the ability of opposition parties to protect democracy after these leaders have attained power. So let me unpack that second part of this statement. Some minimal belief in politics, politicians, and political parties is key to formulate successful strategies against executives with authoritarian tendencies. In my work, I've found that in general, institutional strategies with moderate goals, that is, tactics that use Congress, courts, or elections to stop specific anti-democratic reforms, are usually a safer gamble and a better gamble than extra-institutional strategies with radical goals. That is, strategies that do not use Congress, courts, or elections, and they use the streets, things like boycotts, coups, strikes, to remove the executive before the end of her constitutional term. Institutional strategies with moderate goals have three advantages, at least four now. They have four advantages over extra institutional strategies with radical goals. The first one is that you protect the opposition's legitimacy inside and outside the country. Oppositions that do not engage in maximalist strategies are more likely to be seen as democratic, as reasonable, as standard. The second one is that these kind of tactics fail to provide the executive with legitimate reasons to crack down on the opposition, right? When Scott mentioned it earlier today, when the opposition in Venezuela engaged in a coup, then Chavez had a totally legitimate reason to purge the military. When they used PDVSA, the oil company, to try to push Chavez to resign, Chavez had an entire legitimate reason to purge PDVSA, right? So if you use institutional strategies with moderate goals instead, that you don't provide the executive with this legitimate reason. Third, institutional strategies with moderate goals hinder the executive's ability to rally around the flag to push for more aggressive reforms. Again, the opposition is not seen as maximalist. You don't have like these horrible people that are trying to overthrow me, like we need to rally around the flag. You don't get that kind of momentum. And fourth, I think institutional strategies with moderate goals are more amenable to building big tent coalitions, right? When the opposition is more moderate, it's easier for defectors from the executive camp to reach out, to connect. It's less costly for them to engage in politics and negotiation with this other camp. In my work, I compare Colombia and Venezuela, but this applies to many other countries, including Turkey and Poland. In Venezuela, the opposition used a coup, strike, and an electoral boycott to push Chavez out of power before the end of his constitutional term. And each one of these strategies backfired. They gave Chavez legitimate reasons to purge the armed forces and PDVSA and granted him an almost 100% National Assembly that then he was able to leverage to fully co-opt courts and oversight agencies. In Colombia, against Álvaro Uribe, the opposition used institutional strategies with moderate goals, mostly, and they obstructed legislation and leveraged these legislative debates to create litigation resources so that the courts could then rule against specific anti-democratic reforms. In doing so, the opposition kept its democratic credentials. It protected courts and oversight agencies from a vicious attack and created an environment that allowed them to build a bigger coalition. Eventually, Uribistas started to defect, and it was easier for them to work with the opposition in delaying bills or even blocking them or changing them as they were pushed through Congress. Overall, at the end of 8 years, Álvaro Uribe had to step down, and Venezuela has gone into a deep, deep authoritarian retrenchment. Now, the main differences between these two countries, there are very significant differences, and in an academic conferences, I would go in detail about them. But I think the difference I want to focus your attention on is that in Venezuela, citizens, when Hugo Chavez came to power, citizens were undergoing a deep state of anti-politics. Anything politician was bad, right? Politicians were disrespected, people were disgusted with politicians, right? Which of course created a vacuum of leadership, and civil society organizations, in this case, some of them quite radical, occupied that space, right? And they started pushing for what they knew what to do, and because they were not amenable to sort of more, because politics was not the rule of the only game in town, they were less likely to be able to focus on how do we negotiate our way out, and more likely to focus on how do we get this guy out of power. In Colombia, it's not like parties were super strong. They were actually quite weak, but anti-politics was not as prevalent. Traditional parties have kind of gone down, but there were new parties emerging, and individual politicians had survived sort of the demise of their own old institutions. And these actors played a huge role in leading the opposition. Not only framing institutional strategies, not only creating these obstruction techniques or creating spaces for electoral competition, but they also created spaces for articulating civil society groups around these tactics in a way that was incredibly fruitful to stop specific anti-democratic reforms. Which takes me to the last point, and I haven't even gotten one of those. People accuse me of not giving social movements due credit. And so here's what I'm gonna say. I think social movements are key, but it's hard for them to succeed when they are disarticulated. The recent mobilizations in the US, I think, are a great example of this. I attended one of these rallies, and it was starking how you saw people mobilizing for different demands. And I was thinking, if I was a politician and I wanted to do something, I wouldn't know where to start, right? And so I think these mobilizations were great in showing discontent, in showing that we want people to do something, but they're less good at kind of articulating what, right? And I think political parties could play a greater role in this regard, right? A great example of this is Guatemala, where opposition candidate Bernardo Arevalo and his party, Semilla, chose to participate in elections despite horrible odds. He had a chance of winning like 3% of the votes a month before the election. And yet, he and his party chose to stay in the country. Oh my God, we jumped from 0 to 1 minute. Being there allowed him to seize a small window of opportunity where after banning most opposition candidates, the governing coalition was feeling safe, that they could put 2 of their candidates and either one was gonna win. The governing coalition ended up splitting, and Arevalo was able to get in the runoff with a little over 10% of the votes. Like, this was a real window of opportunity. And once in the runoff, the story is a different one, because the entire opposition, like the voters that did not like the government, coalesced behind Arévalo, and he won the election. Now, this strategy by itself wouldn't have worked if it wasn't by the support of social movements, in particular, a well-organized, well-mobilized, well-structured indigenous and peasant movement that, although they disagree with Arévalo in many things, and they had other concerns, and they had been fighting battles that maybe Arévalo was not sort of a leader of, were able to coalesce around the election and organize and mobilize systematically and sustain these mobilizations for weeks to protect the electoral results. That was the demand. At the end of the day, between the pressure, the social movements, and this is not necessarily independent, but social movements created enough attention among citizens and called the attention of the international community that eventually the corrupt pact, the authoritarian coalition, had to give in and accept Arévalo taking office. So, in a way, I think political parties are key, not because they replace social movements and civil society organizations, but because they're able to articulate them in a way and provide opportunities for them to be more effective. Thank you very much.
That's perfect. So Dr. Gamboa is talking about political parties. I'm here now to talk about electoral management bodies, which is my area of research. So thank you again for this opportunity to speak, especially to all of you who are actively working in this area. So it's a captive audience of people. So what I'd like to talk about today are the 5 key threats that I see electoral management bodies facing with executive aggrandizement, and potentially how to fix them, suggestions at least, of areas to move forward. All right, so I'll just get straight to it because I know the timer is running. Okay, so number 1, the first threat that I see for electoral management bodies is that there has been a move to indirect influence of EMBs rather than, or in addition to, influence of citizens and parties. So what's the problem here? We've seen an evolution of how election manipulation happens over time. There was a time when the best way to do that would be to stuff some ballot boxes or bribe some voters. And then autocrats or would-be autocrats discovered that they could actually just indirectly influence who could run. If they're not even on the ballot, I don't need to stuff the ballot box. That's fantastic. But now we've moved into this area where we're starting to see an indirect influence of EMBs in their activities. Why bother even manipulating an election if you can just have the EMB announce whatever result you want? And this is an area where EMBs are coming increasingly under threat and pressure. If you're going to announce results in your favor, you can either get the EMB on board or discredit them entirely. And we've seen examples of that recently in Venezuela in the 2024 presidential elections. A formerly independent National Electoral Council cooperated under duress with the regime not to release the tally sheets, so no one could authenticate what was likely fraudulent results. And then another example, much closer to home for many of you, when President Trump calls Georgia's Secretary of State and asks for more votes. And in this case, he was able to say no. But both are really interesting cases about EMBs being under pressure to influence the election. And I'm going to offer a few suggestions as to how I see this being potentially resolved, or at least avenues to go down that route. The first is supporting leadership in electoral management bodies, and this is long-term leadership planning. One thing I've noticed by working directly with EMBs is that many people come to the field from very different fields, different areas of backgrounds. They're incredibly devoted to free and fair elections, but they're coming in from potentially from another government department and leaving. There's a lot of turnover happening. And so fostering talent, career projection, and working on succession planning can be one of the ways to really strengthen the human resources that then puts these people in place to stand up to would-be authoritarian leaders, to put them in a place that they can say no because they've been in a position and supported in long-term leadership. Another way that the scholarly community has looked at how to strengthen EMBs when facing these issues is pointing to a concept that the international idea would call resiliency, so putting in place other institutions that can shore up electoral management, things like strong media, strong political parties, strong civil society. Myself and Toby James, who co-directs the Electoral Integrity Project with me, we call this EMB interdependence. The reality is there's not one body who runs elections in most countries. Instead, EMBs are working with other bodies. And so if those other bodies can also be shorn up to have better strength, then when the time comes that they might have to say no to a would-be autocrat, they have people who have their back. So that was the first issue of indirect influence of EMBs rather than stuffing ballot boxes. Number two, electoral management has become a political issue subject to disinformation. There was a time, even in my memory, where the administration of elections was seen as a boring technocratic issue. But it has recently captured the attention of political parties and pressure groups worldwide, potentially because of polarization, effective polarization, closer results, things like that. But it started to attract the attention of leaders as a way to politicize electoral management. To give some examples, the 2020 election where all of a sudden postal voting, which many of us would say is simply a means of accessibility, became a highly partisan issue. And my most favorite example is the many media interviews I had to do in the last few weeks about tiny pencils in Canadian elections. I'm now the tiny pencil girl in Canada. So essentially, there was issues in the United States with Sharpies, bleeding, which somehow made its way up to Canada because Elections Canada gives you a tiny little pencil to mark your vote, but then what if it gets erased? None of this was domestic. None of this was coming naturally out of the Canadian context, but you're starting to see the spillover of disinformation about elections and the politicization of elections in places you would never expect to see it, like in Canada, where all of a sudden tiny pencils are the top story of the news. So what can be done about that? This is one spot where I think formally independent election management bodies can be very important. A lot of the research has shown that you can have governmental or mixed forms of electoral management that can be in practice just as independent as a formally independent body. But every time that I spoke to a media person about tiny pencils, they would ask, how do we know we can trust Elections Canada? And I could point to, here's how they are independent from the current government. Here is why they're at arm's length. Here's how their budget is independent. Here's how their choices are independent. And so these formal processes of institutions being in place and being strengthened can't be overlooked. The other thing that I'd encourage EMBs to do is to get ahead of the game. So this idea of pre-bunking. I think disinformation and how to deal with that is a whole other kettle of fish that I don't think scholars have quite found the silver bullet yet, if it actually exists. But I think EMBs need to increasingly not just be in the role of running elections, but also in the civic education field too. That quiet approach that many EMBs, including Elections Canada back home, were taking may not always be the appropriate way to go about it now. And so being able to engage in things like pre-bunking, where you are providing information ahead of time, just FYI, everybody, we're going to be using pencils. Here's why we do it, and getting out ahead. And you can see a lot of EMBs starting to get into that pre-bunking information space. Things like Elections Canada's ElectoFacts, other EMBs around the world have this, knowing that they're going to be dealing with these sorts of politicization of electoral management. So that's the second thing, the politicization of something that was once non-controversial. The third is taking advantage of uncertainty brought by new technologies. There's obviously been a rapid acceleration of election technologies, which affects the information space, which I won't get into it now, but also getting into the actual process-based use of technology. And technology can be very promising for increasing accessibility, for automating workflows, but it also brings some challenges that can be used by those would-be autocrats, especially relating to privacy, security, and manipulation of these technologies for partisan gains. I'll give an example of Zimbabwe's biometric voter registration system, something that was brought in with the idea that it would help improve the voter registration rolls. And it had promised to do that, but then there ended up being challenges with how it was procured, who it was registering and who it wasn't registering, and public mistrust. And so to deal with this, we're noticing some really key issues. One is a digital divide between who is benefiting from technology and who is not. And that can be as simple as who has electricity that day or who has enough internet bandwidth to use these technologies. And would-be autocrats being able to leverage that in order to use the digital divide in their favor. Procurement of electoral technologies is a huge issue. These are very large government contracts, and many EMBs do not have the in-house expertise and have to become reliant on external vendors and experts, essentially. And you'll get these issues now of who actually has ownership of data or technology or access to them. So the introduction of this whole new actor of electoral technology vendors, when you have a vendor who sells you paper, you kind of know how to use the paper after, but there becomes a whole other set of issues and a whole new actor moving into this field. And in the case of Zimbabwe, this was a Chinese company, and that potentially then had issues with biometric information of citizens being accessed by people who maybe shouldn't. It became a source of intimidation. Do you want them to have your information? And that leads to the other issue of political trust in technology. Using technologies in the electoral process, we often call it a bit of a black box. You don't see what's happening in the same way that you do when you put a piece of paper in a ballot box. And whether or not these technologies are in fact trustworthy, there's definitely clear research that citizens has some reticence about adopting these technologies, and that even that reticence itself can be used by those interested in shoring up their power. If it doesn't work in your favor, well, you can just say the technology didn't work, because you don't see it very well, and voters are primed to feel, oh yeah, I didn't see it happen either. What do you do about that? Working on standards for electoral technology, I have incredible colleagues and international organizations who are doing exactly that and building standards, especially as EMBs want to move into that space, to give them the sorts of safety protocols required. Interagency cooperation, where EMBs may have to work with organizations and groups that they had never worked with before to ensure the security of their technology. Number 4, financial pressures being used to set EMBs up to fail, austerity measures being put in place and saying, sorry, we just don't have the money to run this. This happened even in the UK government in 2024. Electoral officials wrote to the UK government saying, we don't have enough money and we can't run this election in the way we're supposed to. The COVID-19 pandemic was used to postpone or even cancel elections because of a lack of fund in places like Jamaica, Bosnia and Herzegovina. And so focusing on 2 things, the magnitude and the source of funds, is really important. We want to make sure that we have budgets that are not going to be affected by the political motivations of the actors providing that funding. An example being in Canada, where we have 2 separate budgets for the Chief Electoral Officer. One for its statutory authority, draws directly as much as it needs to do what Parliament has told it to do, which is one way to go about making sure it's not reliant on the executive or Parliament. And then also looking at where you are getting that funding. A lot of EMBs get their funding from foreign aid, and established democracies really need to stand up, because the reality is that if they're not coming to you for assistance, they're going to go to somebody else, and that somebody else is not likely to be as pro-democracy. And that's where a lack of US leadership at the moment is proving to be quite problematic. And then finally, we often talk about top-level issues, but on the ordinary side of things, ordinary street-level bureaucrats, of the poll workers and the people who are working in elections on the ground. This freedom can be incredibly helpful to ensure that there can be innovation, but it can also allow for corruption and discrimination. And this can be tied to issues of decentralization of electoral management. One example being even here in the United States, where voter identification laws, for example, have been seen to be discriminatory based on who's asking for it and who's not. And so on the one hand, decentralization can be helpful, but I'm much more of the mind that the centralizations of training of these people, of policies and procedures, can be one step towards ensuring that those on the ground working on elections are also not falling prey to some of the rhetoric that they might hear their leaders speaking about. So 5 recommendations then for EMBs, those who work on them and those who work with them: to build leadership capacity, to safeguard independence, engage in civic education, watch who you take money from, have standards for tech and be wary about them, and focus on strengthening your local electoral officials. And I'll leave it at that as my time's up, but happy to chat more about these in a few minutes.
I counted 5 sleeping people already, so please wake up and listen to me, okay? I'm going to tell you interesting stories, horror stories here, mostly. So let me begin by thanking the Keough Institute and the Keough School and the Kellogg Institute and my good friend Mark here for making the connection and our chair here. It's a real honor to be here with colleagues and friends and even some comrades I met who are just not studying democracy but trying to defend it. I came here as this conversation as an academic, but my connection to the topic runs deeper. Over the past 2 election cycles, I worked really closely with Turkey's opposition parties, political leaders, and civic society groups, offering them research support and strategic advice, as we like to call it, just to make it fancier. The topic is deeply personal as well. I was born and raised in a very rough neighborhood in Istanbul. So this is my positionality statement, right? So where politics was part of everyday life and in complicated and often very painful ways. I've seen political repression up close. My cousins were tortured because they were ultranationalists when I was a kid. I was beaten by the police because when I was an undergraduate student, protesting the rights of headscarf-wearing girls. And now today, some of my friends, colleagues, and former students are in jail because they dared to raise their voices. So it's personal as well. And I know to my bones that it's ordinary people who pay the price when institutions fail. So today, what I want to do is I want to offer some reflections on how Turkey's electoral institutions, once widely respected, were gradually captured by executive power, and what we can learn from the successes and failures of resistance to that. My underlying argument to everything I will say will be this. Turkey's story is not a simple story of democratic decline. It's a story of a fragile, incomplete democratization that never fully took root and ultimately unraveled. Authoritarianism sometimes happens with sudden ruptures, coups, crackdowns, other forms of dramatic power grabs, but as Scott highlighted in his talk this morning, institutional capture is usually very banal, boring, incremental, and dropped in the language of reform and legality. It can happen through laws, court rulings, constitutional amendments, all perfectly legal, all in daylight. Right? And I want to be clear here. I will tell the story, sort of the Turkish story, really brief. The AKP, Erdogan's movement and political party, wasn't wrong in its early criticism of the old order. The old order, the Kemalist state, was exclusionary. It relied on unelected officials, military, judiciary, bureaucracy to block representative democracy. From 1960 coup to 2000s, Turkey, as I should say it now, Turkey saw military interventions, party bans, judicial overreach, all sorts of things, right? In 2007, when the AKP's presidential nominee, Abdullah Gül, was blocked by the judiciary through manipulating parliamentary quorum rules, AKP cast itself convincingly as a champion of democracy, both domestically and globally. Globally, mainly because it was treated as the existence proof of a Muslim democracy. That remains as the sorrow of an unraveled mystery, as one Turkish poem puts it, but that's a different story. I'm not going to get into it. Then came the 2010 referendum. The president would now appoint most constitutional judges, and the Judicial Council overseeing appointments was restructured under executive influence. But here lies the puzzle, right? So the judiciary was opened up, but in ways that made it more vulnerable to political capture. Oversight bodies were restructured, but without guardrails to protect their independence. So Mümtazar Türköne, a prominent liberal supporter at the time, then he was jailed after the coup attempt, admitted, he said, quote, "We thought we were deepening democracy, but we were actually digging its grave." And I want to be clear. here as well. I'm not suggesting that the actors involved necessarily had bad intentions, right? Quite the opposite. They probably believed sincerely that they were democratizing the system. And that's what makes this story so unsettling for me. The real danger wasn't the malicious intent, it was the unintended consequences of well-intentioned reform in an unstable and chaotic institutional environment. I'll briefly return to this point towards the end because I think it sits at the heart of a broader dilemma, which I am struggling with, and that is, how do you dismantle an undemocratic order without opening the door to something even more dangerous? Between 2011 and 2015, the AKP tightened its hold on judiciary, marginalized independent media, fractured alliances with liberals and Kurdish actors, shut down universities. So if you can get away with a budget cut, you should feel lucky. The language of pluralism gave way to logic of dominance. By the time of the 2016 coup attempt, the groundwork had already been laid. Erdogan declared the coup attempt a gift from God and used emergency powers to purge the bureaucracy, academics, business world, media outlets, and consolidated his executive control. They were calling this cleansing Turkey's guts. In 2017, a narrow referendum abolished the parliamentary system in favor of a hyper-presidential regime, that's what I call it. And that referendum would mark a critical turning point in how elections are governed, which I will come in a moment. And Erdogan himself announced at the end, he said, "We have buried the old Turkey for good." So let me now turn to the electoral institutions, which is the focus of this panel, especially the Supreme Electoral Council of Turkey, YSK. For decades, the YSK had a reputation for professionalism, even during periods of deep political conflict. It was seen as one of the few institutions that played fair, but that reputation masked a structural vulnerability. Its members are senior judges selected by Turkey's high courts. And those courts, after the 2010 reforms, became increasingly politicized because once the executive secured the influence over judicial appointments, the independence of the YSK also began to erode. We saw the early signs of this in 2014 local elections when the council dismissed over 150 electoral complaints, many from opposition strongholds, without serious review or justification. But the real breaking point came during the 2017 constitutional referendum, the vote that would dismantle Turkey's parliamentary system. On the day of the referendum, just hours before polls closed, the YSK issued a stunning announcement. It said it would accept ballots that lacked the official stamp, a basic requirement under Turkish election law. This wasn't a procedural ambiguity. It was direct violation of clear legal rules and decades of precedent. And you know the justification the council used? The will of the people. What a phrase, huh? Goes everywhere. Of course, the timing and rationale were deeply suspect. The decision was taken after voting had begun. Estimates vary, but it might have affected over 1.5 million ballots, more than the referendum's margin of victory. International observers condemned it. Of course, they love condemning stuff. The OSCE called it a breach of Turkish law, electoral integrity. You know, when Turkish people hear these condemnations, you know, the opposition people in Turkey, they hate all these people in the West even more. You know, you're not doing anything, you just condemn stuff. You know? That happens. Decision stood, though. But the real scandal wasn't just the ruling itself, and that's where the lesson lies. It was that there had been no earlier pushback. No mass protests, no legal challenges with teeth, no institutional preparedness on the side of the opposition. The opposition and civil society more broadly had come to rely on YSK's supposed neutrality and reputation. They were caught off guard when the referee changed the rules mid-match. And here's the thing. When that moment passed without serious resistance, something shifted. The threshold of the permissible moved. It reminds me of an old Turkish saying. It says, sarı buzağı verirsen ahıra gelirler, which translates as, if you give them the yellow calf, they'll come for the whole herd. They came for the whole herd. In other words, the lesson is, when early overreach goes unchallenged, it doesn't satisfy power, it emboldens it. So I get the 2-minute warning. So can executive overreach be resisted and reversed? Well, there are warnings and flashes of hope. The most vivid example of hope came in 2019 when Istanbul's mayoral election was annulled after a narrow opposition win. Many feared this would crush morale, demobilize voters, signal the futility of the ballot box, but something remarkable happened. The opposition reframed the rerun as a referendum on democracy itself, and İmamoğlu didn't just win, he won in a landslide. But moments don't take movements, my friends. The monitoring networks of 2019 weren't institutionalized. The legal victories won in European courts were largely ignored at home. So what could it actually take to reverse it, not symbolically, but systematically? Before everything else, we need a civic culture that doesn't vanish between election cycles. What we need is sustainable pluralism, I call it. Watchdog organizations, democratic education, grassroots organizations. And this is where we need support from institutions like Democracy Initiative, Kiosk School, and cooperations on this end. We do need it. 30 seconds. Going back to my point about intentions, we need a politics of resistance that doesn't mirror what it seeks to overcome. Because under pressure, even democratic actors can slip into habits of polarization, revenge, and identity-based exclusion, and it might never become possible to go back again. Because here's the disquieting truth, my friends. Erdogan, too, once stood where Ekrem İmamoğlu, the main opposition leader, stands now, promising to restore the people's will against an accountable elite. He began as a reformer with the language of justice and democratic renewal. But power accumulates, trust corrodes, moral flexibility kicks in, and the line between defending democracy and dominating it is thinner than we think it is. Hope is necessary, but it should never come without memory. Let me stop here, and thank you very much.
I apologize for speaking from here because after COVID, I got the muscle loss in my legs. But I must tell you that although I'm a bureaucrat, 40 years standing, my spine is still intact. I was the Chief Election Commissioner of India for 2 years out of 6 years in the Election Commission. And when you talk of India, you are talking of half the world, if not more. We have nearly 1 billion voters, which means more than every continent, much more than every continent. It's actually 90 countries rolled into one. Yet, Constitution has empowered us and experience has given us the skill to conduct these elections, very complicated, by clockwork precision. We have a polling station which is 1,200 kilometers from India's mainland and only 180 kilometers from Indonesia. There also we have to give as good an election as in the national capital. And why we give equal importance to every nook and corner, that every vote counts. We have an interesting example where one very important leader in Rajasthan, who would have been Chief Minister of Rajasthan, lost by 1 vote. And interestingly, his wife had not voted. So we investigated. I asked the gentleman what happened, and he said not that she was upset or angry with him, but she and her daughter had gone to a temple, which was a bit far. So for us, there are 3 lessons here. That every vote counts. Second, you can't take even your family for granted. Third, on the day of poll, the most important temple is the polling station. That's something which politicians have understood. I would like to thank the organizers for hosting a conference on a unique subject. I've been talking about this all over the world for almost 20 years. But there is hardly any discussion and deliberation on political parties, and that too with reference to opposition parties. That's a very wonderful idea, and we have something to share on that thing. Surprisingly, Indian Constitution, which is one of the most detailed constitutions in the world, had no mention of political parties. We still keep debating why it happened. Was it an oversight or was it deliberate? It was mentioned in the acts which followed, and an executive order of the Election Commission on Election Symbols Order in 1968. Our constitution came into place in 1950. So in 68 is the first time when symbol allotment to political parties, that was discussed. Now, we noted that the gap between the power of the ruling party and the opposition is enormous. And that is because of the electoral system that we follow, which is Westminster model of first past the post system, where winner takes all. And in this case, taking all means actually real all. The others are nobodies. And which is perhaps the theme of today. In India, we have too many political parties. We had 2,782, but that was yesterday. Now, the kind of competition, the ugly competition which goes on, the elections have become increasingly competitive. And there are some interesting terms which you may not have heard before. Horse trading. Have you heard of horse trading? There's an everyday expression in Indian politics. When the politicians are bought over by the other party. Or turncoats. Have you heard the term turncoats? Our political parties have no ideology. Wherever they see their future, the winning chances, they move very seamlessly. Unfortunately, that is the reality. Then, although Constitution provided for separation of powers between the three arms of the government, executive, legislature, and judiciary, but the executive power is trying to dominate, and actually is able to dominate by various means, fair and foul. Lately, more foul. Among the checks and then there are checks and balances. While Parliament passes law, there is a provision for judicial review. Judiciary can declare the law ultra vires, unconstitutional. So, therefore, it becomes important for the executive to control all organs of the government, including the judiciary. I have also experienced that ultimately it is the incumbent who matters. The man at the top makes all the difference. The rest is all theory. If the Chief Justice is good, he will not allow to be bulldozed by the executive. But we have had successive Chief Justices who sat over cases of Election Commission for years. What can be of bigger public interest than an election matter? But no, they have no time. 6 years, 5 years, 7 years. So that is the kind of thing which we have experienced lately, which upsets their constitutional balance. Now, in the entire exercise, level playing field is the most important, which is what Election Commission tries to ensure if it acts honestly. Out of 75 years, Election Commission has had a brilliant track record of 60 years plus, but only last 10 years, it has shown signs of weakness. Because although our system was defective, the most powerful commission in the world had the most defective system of appointment of commissioners. The government of the day unilaterally appointed us. I'm a beneficiary of that system. But Constitution, first you understood the importance of the constitutional responsibility, and it provided you protection. Although we were appointed by the government of the day, but the day we took over, our connection was cut off, umbilical cord was cut off. They could not dictate to us, they could not even call us, and they could not remove us except through impeachment like judges of the Supreme Court. So for 60 years, despite our being appointees of the ruling party, we all acted very fairly. The whole world acknowledged it. Lately, 2-3 incumbents have fallen from the standard, and everybody can see everything, and it has not given us a good name. Now, I have my own the attitude towards the opposition was to treat them as underdogs, because government has all the power. Those people having been in power earlier, but now they are out of power. My instruction to my field staff, which by the way, 15 million people conduct the elections for us. Our instruction to the staff is to treat opposition leaders with kindness, with openness. Whenever they seek appointment, open the door. And that worked very well, because we need the credibility and the trust of the opposition in the institution to conduct free and fair election. Now, executive encroachment must happen through the appointment system. The matter went up to Supreme Court that this is an anomaly, that the government of the day appoints the chief election commissioner and who is all powerful. There are 3 commissioners actually. One is the senior most, the chief. The other 2 are members. Now, while chief has the constitutional protection, the other 2 have no protection, which means they feel they are like on probation. They are looking at over their shoulder whether the government is happy. Will they really promote me or not? Now, this is very, very unfair, and we have been demanding that there should be protection to the entire commission and not to one individual. And then the Supreme Court recently said that there should be a collegium system, a collective decision making, where leader of the opposition and Chief Justice and the Prime Minister, the 3 of them will decide. The government passed an act which they should have done 50, 60 years ago, but finally they did. But the collegium, the character of the collegium, it consists of the Prime Minister and a minister appointed by him and the leader of opposition. Chief Justice is out. Now, what do you expect from this collegium? It is 2-1. Sitting here, you can see what kind of judgment will come. Now, abuse of resources by the government is a major issue in the election and fairness of election. When the elections are almost due, you see for months full-page advertisements and many pages of government publicizing their achievements. Now, that is a political propaganda at the cost of the public, which is not fair. And then they also can change campaign finance rules. In India, they introduced electoral bonds, which took away all the transparency we had, and who is paying how much money through the bond was kept secret. And the reason given was that the donor wants secrecy. Why would donor want secrecy? To hide quid pro quo. What licenses, what contracts, and what bank loan they will get with which they will run away to London. Half of them are in London for the last 10, 15 years. So the executive desire to have control over every institution is overbearing, and we have to do something about it. The fragmentation of the opposition, as I mentioned, which is compounded by the phenomenon of the horse trading. They're bought over by the party overnight, they change the party. And judicial deference. The most disturbing thing these days is how the government can control every institution, any institution, by using enforcement agencies. The government has a dossier on everybody, or even the incoming Chief Justice. And he or his family, if they have any misdemeanor of any kind, financial or anything, but all that needs to be done is to call the Chief Justice, show him his file, and he behaves. So then public, in the first session, both the speakers mentioned the word polarization again and again. Polarization, unfortunately, has become a foolproof strategy of winning elections. Polarize and win, that is something which has been happening, and we have not seen the counter coming in the near future. So these are the concerns which we need to understand and try and deal with it through civil society, through judiciary, through media is totally under the control of the government, either bought or threatened, because all the media houses are run by corporate entities, and corporates have their business interests. They cannot be against the government. So that thing has been understood by the government, and they're using it to their advantage. I think we have a great stake in democracy, and all of us have to put our heads together to find ways and means to ensure that the democracy continues to be on the right track. Thank you very much.
Well, we've clearly heard a lot. We've covered a lot of different countries and a lot of different themes. We've heard about opposition parties, electoral management bodies. There's a lot here to grapple with, but I want to start by posing a question to the panel. How do we deal with a situation where the very advocacy for democratic principles becomes a partisan question? And I think that affects both opposition parties. It's one thing to say we're in favor of democracy, quite another if by saying that you are putting yourself in opposition to another party that maybe isn't explicitly anti-democracy. We heard that in the first panel. That's not usually the language that's used, but often the issues that get raised do have this partisan inflection. And similarly with the administration of elections, how do we deal with the fact that in the case of the tiny pencils in Canada, it's not like all across the country, every party was concerned about the tiny pencils. I'm guessing it was on one side. Canada's multidimensional, so it wouldn't be just one side. It'd be like in one space in this multidimensional party system. So the broad question is, how do we deal with the fact that increasingly the very question of democracy and democratic principles and norms and such has become a partisan issue?
I think the problem here is what people think of democracy, right? What people believe democracy is and is not. So if you ask people in strong Chavistas in Venezuela, is Chavez democratic? At least until 2024, they would have told you, yes, absolutely, he wins elections. And, his party keeps winning elections. And I have no idea why the opposition are complaining. I think democracy becomes a partisan issue because the discourse of democracy is, to a certain extent, a discourse used by political elites, right, as such. But I don't think it needs to be partisan if you discuss other things that are related and more popular, like freedom, right? Freedom, for me, is essential for democracy. Freedom of speech, freedom to travel. And I think if you speak in terms of freedom, rule of law, these are concepts that are significantly easier to convey and significantly easier to rally around, both to get, in the case of the United States, your sitting at home Democrats, to put it that way, but also to get Republicans that truly believe in these principles. I think we need to, I think sometimes we're convinced somehow that voters of autocrats in the US or outside the US do not believe in democracy. I just think that they conceive of democracy slightly different, and I think we need to meet them at the concepts that they value: freedom, rule of law. These kind of things I think is significantly easier to campaign around and to build a platform around.
Other thoughts?
Yeah, I might speak from the Turkish experience again. We've recently run an experiment on these court rulings against İmamoğlu. His corruption, and he doesn't have a university diploma and stuff like that. And the people, the AKP voters who care about these issues are mostly caring about those issues because of the economic consequences. There's a cost because, the stock market collapsed and stuff like that. So they see a democracy almost like an instrumental for their economic well-being. So this was in the experiment we did with Mark as well. When you ask them, survey questions, about democratic preferences, as Laura said, they will tell you that they care about it, but what they care about is it really about democracy? Sort of the normative preferences are a completely different thing. So I think there are two things here. One is One is the stick way, what to do when democracy becomes a partisan issue. One is the stick way of doing it. Hey, if you don't like democracy, you have to live with poverty kind of message. And the second is a long-term project where you need to basically water the civic culture flower, but that's gonna take long time, right? So I think in the short term, it's maybe about showing them the consequences, sort of the concrete consequences of losing democracy, so that it becomes a nonpartisan issue. And in the long term, you need all these long-term grassroots movements and education and civic culture development. So two things I see in long and short term.
Yeah.
The thoughts?
I'll add something, particularly from the Canadian context. Here's the Canadian talking about Canada. Who knew that would happen? So it's interesting. We have some research that's under review right now, but we're very confident in it. Tracking essentially trust in elections in Canada over time from, I think, 2008. And there was a time when there was really no partisan divide in terms of trust in elections Canada, trusting elections in Canada. And then things start to change after the 2026 election, and then in the US. Things start to change a little more after the 2020 election in the US. And so increasingly, we're noticing that the narratives of lack of trust, narratives about tiny pencils being dangerous, are related to what's going on in other contexts. It's spilling over outside of the US border because of the way that people are consuming their media these days. Two of the biggest correlates of this lack of trust that is growing among only those on the right side of the ideological spectrum are consumption of US media and conspiratorial thinking in general. And so if there's a way that I think countries who are also dealing with these issues, so the reality is that autocrats learn from each other, but citizens also learn from each other because we are now connected on social media, is to strengthen local media, and that doesn't need to be traditional journalists, but I think the best case for the CBC, the Canadian broadcaster, is this most recent election and seeing what kind of information people are accessing, and then strengthening strong electoral management institutions that when there are questions, everyone can point to and say, but we trust them, but they're good, we like them. And so I think one of the things that we potentially underestimate is the role of spillover and the fact that what was once a domestic issue of how we run our elections is very much influenced by other contexts. And if I can just add one thing about look and see what this could be. I look at the last Canadian election, and there was not a lot of rhetoric about. There had started to be Pierre Poilievre, our Conservative Party leader, had a lot of Trumpian rhetoric at the beginning, and then the minute the 51st state thing happened, the tariffs happened, Canadians were like, oh, but we don't want that. And I think that was a huge wake-up call. And you'll notice that after the Canadian election, where it could have very easily been situations where stop the steal could have happened here in Canada. That rhetoric was waiting, it was parked, it was ready to go. There were ridings where people lost by one vote. It was primed, it was ready to go, but they didn't weaponize it because they knew that it was politically untenable now that we as Canadians have seen what has happened in the American context. So thanks for that, I guess. But I think showing people here's your other option, right?
Sure.
Yeah.
Did you want to say anything?
Yeah. My experience is that the poorest of the poor in the country, in India, are most interested in democracy because that is the only power they have, the power of vote, which they exercise. The turnout of poor people is the largest. Is the middle class, particularly urban middle class, which is indifferent to the results because their life goes on. And unfortunately, they were not only not voting, they were bragging about it. Oh, I've never voted in my life. So we, Election Commission, we decided that we'll launch a movement, voter education movement, and where we'll make it very embarrassing for them not to vote. And we launched a media campaign, very effective, and after that, in that election, 14% increase in turnout. And the same people who were twirling their mustache and saying that we have never voted in their life, they were showing their marked finger, look, I have voted. There was a term in Indians here, the word Pappu was created, that one who doesn't vote will be called Pappu, a simpleton. So they said, no, we are voting. So we were able to change the attitude of these people. And we feel that civic education, voter education plays an important role, and we have used it effectively.
Thank you. And please join me in thanking our panel.